Now, the battle for the Coral Sea, this battle occurred between the 4th and the 8th of May 1942, as the US fleet turned back a Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby in New Guinea. So by the end of April of 42, the Japanese were ready to seize control of the Coral Sea that's between Australia and New Caledonia. We look at the map now. And they wanted to establish air bases at Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea and at Tulagi in the Southern Solomons. But as we know, the Allied intelligence learned of the Japanese plan to seize Port Moresby and alerted all the available sea and air power. So when the Japanese landed at the Tu-3s, I think there's a mistyping from me. I can't remember the place's name now. When the Japanese landed at this place, the carrier-based US planes from a task force, a task force commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, they struck the landing group, sinking one destroyer, some minesweepers and landing barges. So most of the naval units covering the main Japanese invasion force then left Rabaul near Britain for Port Moresby on May the 4th. And they took a round route to the east, which invited a clash with Fletcher's forces, which we will look at now. So on May the 5th of the 642, the opposing carrier groups sought each other. And the morning of May the 7th, the Japanese carrier-based planes sank a US destroyer and an oiler. Fletcher's plane then sank the light carrier Shoho and a cruiser, and the next day, Japanese aircraft sank the carrier Lexington and damaged the Yorktown, while the US plane so crippled the large Japanese carrier Shukaku that it had to retire from action. So many Japanese planes were lost, that the Port Moresby invasion force, without adequate air cover and harassed by Allied land-based bombers, turned back to Rabaul. So this four-day engagement was a strategic victory for the Allies, as we said before. The battle, which the US Admiral Ernest King described as the first major engagement in naval history in which surface ships did not exchange a single shot, foreshadowed the kind of carrier warfare that marked the later fighting in the Pacific theater. There's a map of this battle. There's the invasion force, and here's the US carrier force, and that was the from Truk, that's the place. The TR3 is Truk. That's the carrier force coming down this route, and then Fletcher making this turn to look for them. They never found each other visually, but their planes did. And that's where the Shoho was sunk. There we have just this reference, Port Moresby's. They were on their way to attack Port Moresby. And yeah, we have Australia at the bottom here. So Lexington was sunk over here. So as we said, it turned out to be strategically a win, but we will look at, in further discussion, we will look at some of the things that went wrong in this confrontation, or didn't play out, let me rather put it this way, things that didn't play out as advertised in that during that fight. Now the main one, this is obviously it's going to take a bigger part of the presentation, is the Battle for Midway. And I thought we can go back a little bit, I think to 1859, when the Midway Islands were claimed for the United States on July the 5th, 1859 by Captain N.C. Brooks. It's a coral atoll consisting of Easter Island and the larger Sand Island to the west. Total land area of just 2.4 square miles, that's 6.2 square kilometers. It was formally annexed by the US in 1867, and the same year a coal depot was established for trans-Pacific steamers, but it was never used. So for many years thereafter, only slight attention was paid to Midway. And then in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt placed Midway under the administration of the US Naval Department, and the atoll became a connecting point for the submarine cable being laid between Hawaii and the Philippines. It was not until the advent of air transport that the real significance of Midway was appreciated. And by 1935, the islands had become a regular stopover point for trans-Pacific flights. Now, it was World War II which conclusively demonstrated the strategic importance of Midway. In 1940, the US Navy began work on a major air and submarine base there. By the following year, Eastern Island would boast 3 runways, while Sand Island had a seaplane hangar, which was built for a squadron of Catalina flying boats. The Sand Island was also home to Midway's defense garrison, as well as a power plant and radio facilities. Japan recognized that control of the atoll would be critical for its plans in the Central Pacific. If the islands could be seized by Japan, then American military presence in Hawaii, which was just 1,100 miles to the southeast, could be seriously threatened. Furthermore, the supply line between the United States and Australia could be severed, and therefore then crippling the Allied war effort and opening the Southwest Pacific to conquest. Now, the US Navy crypto analysts had begun breaking Japanese communication codes early in 1942 and knew for weeks ahead of time that Japan was planning an attack in the Pacific at a location they called AF. Suspecting it was Midway, the Navy then sent out a false message from the base claiming it was short of fresh water, and Japan radio operations sent out a similar message about AF soon afterwards, and that confirmed the location, which is all stuff that we know about. So with Japan's fleet so widely dispersed, Yamamoto had to transmit all strategy over the radio, and this enabled the Navy crypto analysts based in Hawaii to figure out when Japan planned to attack, which was June 4 or 5th, and the planned order of battle for the Imperial Japanese Navy. So with this information, it was Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet. He could work on a plan to combat the invasion. The Japanese assumed that the US carrier Yorktown, which had been damaged during the Battle of Coral Sea, would be unavailable at Midway. In fact, the carrier was repaired in only 2 days at Pearl Harbor Naval Yard and left on May the 30th to regroup with the other US ships near Midway in preparation for Japan's attack. So after the diversionary Japan attack on the Aleutian Islands on June the 3rd, and I will show that on the map a bit later, a group of US B-17 Flying Fortresses flew from Midway to attack Kondo's invasion force, which they mistakenly assumed was the main Japanese fleet. This unsuccessful attack marked the first military engagement in the Battle of Midway. So before dawn of the next day, more B-17s left Midway for a second attack on the Japanese invasion force, also unsuccessful. So meanwhile, Nagumo launched the first phase of Japan's attack as planned and sending 108 Japanese warplanes from the 4 aircraft carriers to strike Midway. So after inflicting severe damage to the US base, the first Japanese attack ended by 7 a.m., leaving the airfield still usable and the US anti-aircraft defense is still functional. Now, shortly after that, just as his pilots informed Nagumo that another airstrike against the base would be necessary, the US aircraft launched from Midway to begin attacking the 4 Japanese carriers without success. It was 10:20 a.m. on Thursday, June the 4th. 47 US Navy dive bombers had found what they were looking for. Far below, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were launching the first planes of a massive strike that would decide the battle for Midway. So far, 2 days of American air and submarine attacks had failed to damage a single ship of the peerless Japanese aircraft carrier strike force. The priceless intelligence advantage of the US that they'd gained through years of backbreaking effort by Navy codebreakers was about to be squandered. Now, the heroic sacrifice of Navy torpedo plane crews who had pressed home their slow-motion attacks in the face of deadly Japanese opposition looked to be in vain. But now, at the last possible moment, 3 squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers from the American aircraft carriers Yorktown and Enterprise had arrived unobserved and unopposed in the skies above the Japanese fleet. Somehow, against all the odds, the Americans had achieved precisely the situation that Navy commanders had dreamed of. Dozens of dive bombers screaming down on Japanese flight decks jammed with gassed up and armed aircraft, fueling hoses snaking about, bombs and torpedoes scattered hastily across the hangar bays. The broad flight decks of the carriers were perfect targets for the American pilots, whose aircraft training and combat tactics had prepared them for precisely this type of attack. Dive bombing developed in the 30s. In 42, it was the most accurate form of air attack. That was the one reason that Navy carrier groups had more dive bombers than any other type of aircraft. By pointing his plane directly at the target until he released his weapon, a skilled pilot could keep his eye on the target throughout his dive and simplify his bomb's trajectory. But success was far from certain. This was just the second great carrier versus carrier battle for the Pacific, and no one yet knew what to expect. The pilots from Yorktown had fought at Coral Sea, but the pilots from the Enterprise had not. Dive bombers from the 3rd US carrier at Midway, the Hornet hadn't even found the Japanese fleet. The pre-war doctrine supposed that aircraft carriers couldn't survive a massed airstrike, but at Coral Sea 1 month earlier, 3 of the 4 fleet aircraft carriers that were attacked, 2 Japanese and 2 Americans, did survive. The Yorktown was one of the survivors. Pre-war doctrine also held that B-17s could effectively bomb ships from high altitude, but attacks against Japanese ships by flying fortresses at Midway scored no hits. It was becoming clear that the real war was going to be different from the conflict that was envisioned. The dive bombing attacks themselves would be difficult. Carriers were big targets, but they were moving fast, and the American pilots would have to fly precise flight profiles to hit them. So during their 40-second dives, the aviators would have to continuously work their rudder pedals and their sticks to correct the plane's speed, heading, and dive angle to remain on target, while the carriers below maneuvered violently. For much of the dive, the pilot could track the target through spotting scopes, similar to the telescopic sights that snipers mounted on their rifles, but the bomber scopes provided only a 3-time magnified view. It was up to the pilots to make the necessary adjustments in the 3-axis to ensure a hit. The plane's dive flaps held the bomber's speed at about 276 knots, giving the pilot a little more time to make adjustments. It also made the plane an easier target for enemy anti-aircraft gunners though, and for defending fighters. For gunners on the targeted ship, a diving plane appeared almost motionless in their sights, slowly growing in size as it neared, which greatly simplified their aim. Fortunately for the dive bomber crews, most anti-aircraft mounts lacked the ability to fire directly up, so the volume of fire that planes faced was limited. American dive bombers typically approached their targets at an altitude of around 20,000 feet, flying at more than 200 knots. When they spotted the ship, the dive bomber pilot increased speed and descended to about 8,000 feet. Since Japanese vessels mostly lacked radar, whenever possible, the Americans approached their targets from out of the sun. When over the target, pilots pulled the noses of their planes up to put the aircraft into a stall, opened their dive flaps, and then turned back towards their target, down towards the target. The ideal dive angle was 70 degrees. A dive might take 30 or 40 seconds during that time. The rear seat, or radio man or gunner on his back facing the sky, would be nearly weightless. The gunners often described how spent shell casings that had fallen to the floor of the plane would drift up past their eyes. The pilot hoped to release his bomb when he was between 2,000 and 1,500 feet above the target. At that altitude, the bomb would fall for less than 10 seconds, but even during that short time, the ship turning at 30 knots might move 500 feet. So the pilot had to fly a narrow flight profile, continuously adjusting his own deflection, speed, and dive angle to correct for the movement of the target, for the effect of gravity, and for the effect of the wind on his plane and on his bomb once it was released. He had to correctly estimate the wind direction and speed and the target ship's current course and speed, and aim where the target ship would be when the bomb reached the surface. If the dive angle was slightly off, the bomb would land short or fly past the target. If the plane's heading was slightly off, the bomb might miss to either side. Since aircraft, even dive bombers, are designed to fly horizontally, putting a plane into a 70-degree dive alters the forces affecting the plane and causes the attacking plane to drift across the target, decreasing accuracy. Dive flaps help to correct this problem, but it was just one more thing that pilots had to contend with. Today, a computer would instantly process the flood of information and fly a correct profile. But in 1942, the pilot was the computer. Once the bomb was released, the aviator pulled out of his dive, and a maneuver that might leave him struggling to breathe, as he experienced as much as 6 times the force of gravity. These stresses were considerable, and dive bombers were built to handle them, but pilots could be rendered briefly unconscious by the forces. If everything went well, the bomber would level up off at about 500 feet and the pilot would start jinking rapidly to avoid anti-aircraft fire from enemy ships and defending fighters. This, of course, was the primary drawback to dive bombing. Pointing your plane at an enemy ship and diving so close as possible before releasing your weapon sounded good in theory and was accurate in practice, but finishing your bombing run directly over your target at 500 feet altitude was insanely dangerous. Shipboard gunners probably couldn't hit you as you flashed by just above their masts, but your escape would leave you in anti-aircraft range for a long time. At an altitude of 500 feet, you would have little room to maneuver if attacked from above by enemy fighters. The vulnerability of dive bombers after releasing their weapons was a major reason why the Germans abandoned dive bombing attacks against land targets whenever enemy fighters were present. By mid-1942, German dive bombers' life expectancy in combat had fallen to less than 5 days. There was nothing easy about hitting a moving target at sea in the face of anti-aircraft fire or defending fighters. The plane is moving, the target is moving, and around the air, and the air around the plane is moving. It takes many hours of practice and considerable skill. At Midway, Marine Corps pilots had just received new dive bombers attacked Japanese ship using glide bombing techniques because they had not been sufficiently trained in dive bombing. They scored no hits. By the time the Navy dive bombers arrived above the Japanese carriers, US land-based and carrier-based planes had been engaging the Japanese formation nearly continuously for 2 hours. While no hits on the enemy vessels had been achieved and more than 35 American aircraft had been shot down, attacks had disrupted Japanese operations, scattered their ships, and had drawn Japanese fighter planes down to the surface of the sea. So we're just repeating that a little bit. Sorry, I think I must have copied this slide here. Okay, this is the point in the dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters all flew at different speeds, coordinating their arrival over a moving target whose location at the time of arrival could only be guessed was impossible in 1942. Planes could only be launched one at a time, so it might take an hour to assemble a full strike force. By then, the first planes aloft would have used 30 minutes or more of fuel circling their own fleet, and without knowing exactly where the enemy ships would be when the strike would arrive, it was impossible to calculate courses and speeds that would bring all the planes over the enemy at the same time. At Midway, American commanders, desperate to strike the Japanese carriers before they could attack the US fleet, sent their planes off in small groups as soon as they were launched. That decision doomed the torpedo bombers, and 39 of the 43 were shot down. But then it opened the way for the dive bombers. So miscommunication between the attacking SBDs almost spared one of the Japanese carriers. McCluskey's Enterprise Air Group commander wanted one of his squadrons to attack the carrier Kaga, and the second to attack the carrier Akagi. But the pilots didn't hear his instructions, and both squadrons dove on the Kaga. At the last moment, one of the squadron leaders, Lieutenant Richard Best, realized what was happening and redirected his five-plane section to attack the Akagi. The luckless Japanese carrier was struck with just one bomb, but the secondary explosions from fuel and armed aircraft ignited massive fires that couldn't be contained. And the Kaga, attacked by more than 20 planes, was struck 4 or 5 times. Meanwhile, the Yorktown squadrons approaching from the other side of the formation dove on the third carrier, the Soraya, striking her with at least 3 bombs and leaving her aflame. The fourth Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was hidden by a rain squall, was not attacked. Now, this would prove disastrous for the Yorktown later, as the undamaged Hiryu would launch a retaliatory strike that would cripple the American carrier, and a Japanese submarine would finish the Yorktown off on June the 7th. So by 10:25 a.m., 3 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers were blazing wrecks. Later that day, Marais would be attacked and destroyed. The Japanese cancelled their planned invasion of Midway and withdrew. Their attempt to destroy the US carriers in a decisive battle was a failure. No one knows for sure how many attacking SBDs were shot down at Midway, but it is clear that 18 of the 47 dive bombers that struck the Japanese carriers that morning never made it back to their ships. 2 more had to ditch near the carriers because the pilots were running too short on fuel to actually land. And some planes were shot from the sky, others crashed into the sea when they ran out of fuel. At least 3 air crewmen were plucked from the sea by the Japanese, and they were interrogated and executed. During the Battle of Midway, the US employed a total of 223 carrier aircraft and 113 land-based planes of various types, including the B-17s, torpedo bombers, fighters, and dive bombers. But the only significant damage inflicted against the Japanese was by the SBD dive bombers. Overall, the United States lost 92 officers, 215 men, an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, and approximately 150 aircraft at Midway. Here we can see on the map, there's Pearl Harbor down at the bottom, Hawaii, 1,100 miles up the Midway Islands, which we can see here. And obviously we know that these carriers were hiding on the northeastern side. There was the Illusion diversionary forces, and there was the main force attacking Pearl Harbor. You can very clearly make up how this thing unfolded. Nice picture of planes readied. There's the, I think it was the Yorktown at an angle, fighting fires on the ship. There you can see some planes coming through the Akak, attacking. Aircraft carrier slowly starting to hang, and this was the damage that we see on the Midway Island, turning a plane around on the aircraft carrier deck. Now, although the Battle of Midway greatly weakened the Japanese fleet, the Imperial Japanese Navy remained potent. When the US Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 42, the Japanese sent surface ships to shell Henderson Field and to drop off Japanese troops on the island. The Marine and Navy SBDs based at Guadalcanal blunted many of these thrusts, though. During the period from August to mid-November, aircraft from Guadalcanal sank 14 transports, 3 destroyers, and 2 cruisers. They had a share in the sinking of the battleship Hiei and damaged 14 other ships. On November the 14th alone, they sank 7 Japanese ships. In addition, during the desperate attempt to hold Guadalcanal, the US Navy engaged in 2 major carrier battles. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz. The SBDs were the Navy's big weapons. Overall, from December 1941 to December of 1942, in 1 year's time, the SBD sank 6 carriers, 1 battleship, 3 cruisers, a submarine, and 14 transports. Some of these kills were made in conjunction with surface ships, but the total is amazing, even when it is qualified. So to put the damage that they did in perspective, this damage was nearly 30% of the tonnage of the Imperial Japanese Navy's pre-war fleet. That's a serious, serious amount. But how deadly was the Dauntless? So on August the 7th, 1942, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai was piloting his Zero in the skies over Sea Lark Channel in the Solomons. He had flown down with a group of other Zeros from the Japanese airfield at Rabaul in New Britain that morning with the express purpose of attacking the ship supporting the first American opposed amphibious invasion of World War II. The Operation Watchtower landings at Gavutu, Tanobagu, Tulgi, and Guadalcanal. So although Sakai would ultimately recover from the wounds he was about to receive, he wasn't aware that he was about to be stung by one of the most lethal aircraft in the US military arsenal, the Douglas SBD Dauntless. As Sakai and his wingman approached the skies above Tulagi, he spotted a group of 8 American aircraft beneath him at an altitude of 7,800 feet. Wrongly assuming that they were Wildcats, Sakai nosed his Zero over to begin an attack, with his wingman obediently following. Closing in on the American aircraft from behind at full throttle, he sensed that the element of surprise was his, but at the range of just 100 yards, Sakai gazed at his targets through his gun sight and reached the sober realization. These were not fighters he was approaching. By this time, it was too late to break off the attack, and Sakai realized that he was attempting to pounce on a group of dive bombers. These aircraft were from the carrier USS Enterprise and were circling above Tulagi awaiting orders to drop their bombs on Japanese targets on the island below. Unlike the Wildcat, the US Navy dive bombers were protected from a rear attack by a tail gunner position in the backseat of the aircraft, piloted by Ensign Eldor Rodenberg. Aviation radio man 3rd Class James Patterson opened fire with his 30 caliber machine gun. He came in fast. I fired at him, but I just don't know if I hit him or not, Patterson remembered. Sakai attempted to turn sharply to the right, pull up, and used the Zero's horsepower to climb away from the Americans, but he was too close, and in the rear seat of one of the other bombers, Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Harold Jones opened fire with Sakai only 100 feet, directly astern of his aircraft. What Jones saw next was a testament to the firepower that was available to the tail gunners. His cockpit exploded, the canopy tore, and something flew out. I could see his face clearly, his body and head forced back against the headrest of the cockpit. The plane went almost vertical upwards and then fell smoking. That was the last I saw of him. As the 8 tail gunners followed the Zero with their machine guns, slugs shattering the canopy glass and hit Sakai, the fragments from the bullet struck him in the chest, the left leg, the elbow, and the face. One tracer round missed his right eye by less than an inch and melted the rim of his goggles. In a brief encounter, the tail gunners expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition and seriously injured one of the best Japanese fighter pilots of the war. Now let's have a look at those guns. The AN-M2 30 caliber machine gun mounted in the tail gunner's compartment was a weapon with a general physical appearance of a downsized M1919 series 30 caliber, with a smaller receiver barrel and a barrel shroud. The M1919s, the AM2 weighed a mere 23 pounds opposed to the 31 pounds of the M19. So that is the M1919. This was the AN-M2. In addition to having a different receiver and barrel than the M1990, the AN-M2 was equipped with a different feed cover, extractor, barrel extension, and bolt. These parts were specially engineered to allow the weapon to feed from either the right or left side of the receiver, which is not we can see here, but it can feed from both ends. And this was a feature that made the AN-M2 versatile for use in aircraft. A 100-round fixed ammunition box was attached to the left side of the weapon to keep the belted cartridges from snagging the inside of the compartment. There you can see them loading ammunition boxes, and here's a good close-up picture of the two AN-M2s, with the one feeding from the left, the one feeding from the right side. Now, this brings us to a question: that were dive bombers more effective than torpedo bombers? And at least for the first couple of years of the war, the answer would be yes. It is pretty much accepted that bombs themselves could only do so much damage to armored warships. Most of the effects came from disabling weapon systems on deck, or killing crew topside and starting fires. Bombs could be particularly lethal against aircraft carriers if they penetrated to the hangars or exploded topside amongst fuel and armed aircraft like at Midway. But unless the bombs or fires they started set off ready ammunition, especially if the ship carried torpedoes, or a close aboard near miss that caused hull damage below the waterline, it was very difficult for bombs to sink an armored warship unless they penetrated to a magazine or the resulting fire spread to one. To sink a ship required letting in water to destroy the ship's buoyancy and stability, and that is what torpedoes were meant for. The problem was that when war broke out, the US Navy was saddled with a slow and obsolete torpedo plane, the TBD Devastator, that carried a slow and unusually defective torpedo, the old Mark 13 air torpedo. Combined with ridiculously slow and low approach speeds required for a successful drop, as well as the general inexperience of the crews, you had a recipe for the disaster against anything but the least defended targets. Anything else required almost total air superiority from escorting fighters and suppression of air defenses, which was normally accomplished by dive bombing and strafing. The TBD's only real successes came against undefended merchantmen in the early hit-and-run raids of 42, and the sinking of the Japanese light carrier Shoho at the Battle of the Coral Sea. But at Midway, where the TBDs went in unescorted against heavy fighter and anti-aircraft opposition, they got slaughtered. The TBM torpedo bomber was a much better plane, but it was only until modifications were made to the Mark 30 torpedo that allowed it to be dropped at higher speeds from higher altitudes did torpedo bombing become a relevant part of US naval aviation warfare again by late 1943. So during the first half of the war, the primary attack plane in the US Navy arsenal was the Dauntless dive bomber. So early problems like fogging windscreens during high altitude dives hampered their effectiveness early on and probably saved the Japanese carrier Shukaku at Coral Sea. But it soon became apparent that with trained crews, the Dauntless could be a deadly plane that could actually take care of itself in battle, even without fighter escort, to a point. It was, of course, vulnerable while approaching fully loaded with bombs, but once in the dive, it was nearly unstoppable, almost impossible for a Zero to catch or for an anti-aircraft to hit. And after dropping, it could zoom away at high speed and was actually fairly maneuverable to avoid pursuing fighters. History will always show the destruction of the 4 carriers at Midway to be the Dauntless' crowning achievement, but where it really shone was during the Guadalcanal campaign, where despite extremely rough field and working conditions, it pretty much owned the seas during the day around Guadalcanal, regularly destroying any troop ships or merchantmen that attempted to land and causing grief to many warships that were unable to get out of reach before daylight. As the war went on, the SBD was eventually replaced by the Helldiver aboard the carriers, though it remained in service for marine aviation. The Helldiver was disliked by many of its crews, particularly the troublesome early models, but soon came to be appreciated for its heavier bomb load and armament and greater speed. They were particularly effective during the sinking of the battleships Yamato and Musashi, causing enough topside damage to severely limit their anti-aircraft fire and allowing torpedo bombers to deliver the killing blow with little opposition. Even the Avenger torpedo bombers were used more in a glide bombing role as the war went on, taking advantage of the large payload capacity and the less skill it took for inexperienced pilots to bomb as opposed to dropping torpedoes. The Japanese tended to follow the same doctrine in sending their dive bombers in before the torpedo planes, but spent more time perfecting their torpedoing skills, which paid off handsomely at Pearl Harbor and at every aircraft battle up to Santa Cruz. Unfortunately, this high skill and aggressiveness in pressing home the attacks cost them almost their entire crews by the end of 42 due to evolving US anti-aircraft weapons and technology, never to be replaced. So for the first half of the Pacific War, the US Navy perfected and emphasized its dive bombing technique, given that the returns were much greater and the losses were much less than dropping torpedoes, which were unreliable at that stage in the war. Once newer aircraft came into being, the torpedo problems were fixed and air superiority was taken away from the Japanese. The torpedo bombing became a relevant part of naval air attacks again. So what killed off the dive bomber? Towards the end of the war, it became clear that the days of a dedicated dive bomber were over. Powerful Corsairs, F4Us, proved to be excellent dive bombers without sacrificing speed and agility in combat. In addition, 5-inch rockets gave the Corsairs and other attack aircraft precision without a dangerously close bomb release. By the time the Korean War began, the enemy had radar-controlled anti-aircraft weapons that made close bombing completely suicidal. So the dive bomber killed off by rockets. Now here we have a list of the surviving Dauntlesses. There's actually quite a number of them. I was surprised when I went through this. New Zealand's got an SBD, sorry. Mistyped the SBD4 in Christchurch. The Solomon Islands have got one on display. And then in America, there's 6 airworthy planes, including one I saw at Planes of Fame and one I saw at Yanks in China. Then display examples 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's another 3 under restoration, of which an SBD5 are ready to be made airworthy as well. So that would leave 7 airworthy examples. So quite a long list of surviving Dauntlesses. So I'm sure many of you have seen at different places. That's the National Naval Aviation Museum. Number 206, survivor of the attack on Pearl Harbor, participated in dive bombing runs against the Japanese carrier during the Battle of Midway. And it's one of the most historic aircraft in existence. This one is at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. Now, this is a very special, the SBD-2P. This was used as a photo reconnaissance aircraft. And it carried a lot of cameras instead of bombs. And what happened was in February 18th, 1944, they had a carburetor icing incident over the Southern Lake, Michigan. And this plane actually struck the Lake Michigan, sank, and stood on its nose for all those years until it was found. I think I haven't got the facts on me now when they recovered the plane. And then there's an example of the US Marine Corps Museum. SBD 3 is now amongst Marine Corps aircraft displayed in the Leatherneck Gallery. You can see the Corsair up top and one below. Now, to summarize, I would say the Dauntless was a hugely successful dive bomber. It was rugged, could be manhandled, and such as with repeated carrier landings, it could take punishment from enemy planes in ack-ack. It carried a substantial bomb load, and it could deliver that bomb load with precision. US Navy pilots loved the handling of the Dauntless. The Zero pilots were wary of the Dauntless. And to sum it up, it was the right plane at the right time with the right capabilities. Thank you.